In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint a winter landscape using gouache paint, and I'm also going to give you some tips on painting winter trees. This is the reference photo that I used for this painting. The location is near Glenorchy in southern New Zealand, and I love these winter trees. I'm painting on watercolour paper, and the painting area itself roughly measures around 18 centimetres by 18 centimetres, and I've taped the watercolour paper onto a board with some masking tape. Now you probably can't see it that well, but I've actually already sketched out the composition just using a 4H pencil. So this is a hard pencil and it produces some very faint marks, which is what I've done here, mainly because I don't want any of the pencil marks to come through my painting. Now, as I said at the start of the video, I'm painting with gouache, and I've actually found that I've been able to treat my gouache paintings much like my oil paintings in many ways, in that I always start by painting the dark values and shadows first. And actually what I have done here is I've started off with more of a wash just to get some of these base colours down, and then I'll be adding thicker layers as I progress through the painting. So just starting off with the shadows of the trees here, and I'm using a mix of ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, and I've mixed in quite a lot of water as well. So let's talk about the colours that I'm using. I'm using Winsor & Newton gouache paints, and they're really nice to paint with, really high pigment in them, and you can get some super bright, natural and vibrant looking colours. So I'm just loving using these paints. And with regards to the colours that I'm using, I've tried to pretty much use the same palette that I use for my oil paintings. So the colours I'm using include permanent white, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue and viridian. So a relatively limited palette there, but I have found that my colour mixing comes much easier and my colours cleaner and more vibrant, so I like using a more limited palette. Also helps to improve the colour harmony in the painting, because I'm more likely to be using common colours throughout my painting. Now at this point I've already blocked in some of the shadows in the background mountains, and that's a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna with a little permanent white and a little alizarin crimson. And again, I've used a lot of water in the mix. And I use these same colours in the cloud shadows as well, which I've loosely marked in. But as I say, I'm just in the wash stage of this painting, so I'm using very watered down colour just to get my base foundation. Now here is where I'm starting to mark in the colours for these winter trees. These trees that grow in this particular area of New Zealand are a mix of European and American deciduous trees, mostly Lombardy poplars and willows. When it comes to marking in the tree canopies, I just treat them as massives, and I don't worry about painting individual branches, stems and twigs. Generally the density of the twigs and the canopy overall gives the appearance that there's still a tree canopy there, even though it has no leaves. So we can block out colours here, and this certainly works well with gouache, and I'd do the same even if I was painting this with oils as well. So just going for these low chroma winter colours. They're very organic looking, mixtures of browns and pastel colours, and I've mostly used varying mixes of burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, which helps to desaturate the colour. There's also yellow ochre, alizarin crimson and titanium white in there, and again I'm still using a thin wash. For some of the shadow areas and the darker areas near the base of the tree, I've mainly used ultramarine blue with burnt sienna. So I'm just marking these in using a range of flat brushes. I'm using Rosemary & Co brushes, my favourite brushes to use, and if you want to get some Rosemary & Co brushes, I've put a link in the description box below. Now I'm still marking in my shadows at this stage, so getting in some of those darker tones in. Also some of the shadows that are being cast by the trees themselves onto the grass and the road as well. This is actually a road, believe it or not, but it's got no asphalt on the top. It's one of those metal roads, so quite dusty in the summer, a lot of gravel on there, but look awesome in paintings. And just a note on the road itself, I've made sure that this is not in the middle of the composition because that would spoil it completely. So I've made the road so it's more to the left of the centre where the vanishing point of the road is. Also the horizon line is a low horizon, so that gives me plenty of space to add those high mountains that are in the background. Now as I start marking in the road here, I actually use the same colours that I've used in the clouds and the background mountains, albeit in different quantities. So this is mostly ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, some permanent white and a little bit of alizarin crimson, but there's a lot of permanent white in the mix because the value of the road is a light colour. It's kind of like a grey colour. But using the same colours that I've used in the background mountain and the clouds and also within the trees, it's going to tie all those colours together, so there's a relationship between all of them, so that's going to contribute to the colour harmony within the painting. So this is something I'm always thinking about. I start marking in the cloud highlights with a mix of permanent white and some burnt sienna, and I allow some of that shadow mix to mix in with the paint, and then I start painting in the sky, and I've used a mix of ultramarine blue, permanent white and a little viridian. Once I've marked in the sky, I started painting in some of the foliage of this pine tree that's on the left side of the painting. This is a Monterey pine. It's a really common tree that's been planted throughout New Zealand. It's been introduced, it's not native to the country, but I think they look really nice in the landscape. So that's on the left side of the painting, and for this I've used a mix of yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue, and there's also a little bit of cadmium red mixed in there as well. If I need to lighten the mixture, which I did later on in the painting, I can just mix in some permanent white, and then also added in viridian as well here and there, just add a few emerald tones into my greens. So done this with the trees and the grass as well, which you'll see in a moment. And actually with regard to the grass, I've actually used similar colours that I've used for the pine trees here, but with more titanium white in the mix, and that's because grass is generally a lighter value colour in the landscape. Grass and skies are some of the lightest values to be found in the landscape, whereas trees are some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape, especially conifers such as pine trees. The foliage is often naturally darker than deciduous trees, and especially when they grow as stands of trees or within forests, you get a lot of occlusion shadow, so a lot of dark accents and dark areas within the trees. So as I say, these are some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape, and certainly if you want your trees to stand out in the landscape, you need to keep this principle in mind. Once I'd marked in the grass, I then started painting some of these trees in the distance. Again, they're Lombardy poplars, willows, black poplars, and I've used the same colours that I've used for the trees in the foreground, but I've added in some more permanent white just to desaturate the colour further. They're kind of a pale low chroma colour. I was able to use that same colour but with more permanent white added to start marking in the slopes of the mountains that are in the background. Now the plants that are growing on the mountains are generally of a low chroma colour anyway. There's lots of tussock grass and other mountain vegetation that's pale, so we've got to make sure that the colour's not overly saturated here, otherwise it will come forward in the painting. Now one of the things I've noticed with gouache paint is some of the colours can dry a bit darker than when you initially lay down the colour, so this is something to keep in mind. But with gouache it's actually very easy to paint over any mistakes or just add more layers to it. So as I say, I'm just getting the foundation of the painting down, and if you look at the painting at the moment, it kind of looks a bit amateurish, like it doesn't really look that detailed or that great. It looks like a kind of bad watercolour really, but you just got to get through this stage, and you just got to keep in mind that it's the initial layers that you've put down and it's just a wash, and as soon as I start adding thicker colour and more detail, the painting's going to look better, much better. But as I say, at this stage I've got a kind of map to work to now. I've laid down the foundation of the painting, and it's going to be easier to build colour and detail on top of that initial layer. Now at this stage of the painting I've got my wash of colours down, and they're already pretty dry at this moment. So it means I can start adding some more layers and begin to add some detail to the painting. So I start off with the furthest zone away, and that's the clouds and sky. I really wanted to tidy up those clouds a bit. Also, I found that the sky had dried a little bit too dark, so that certainly needed to be made lighter in value. And I'm using the same colours that I used just a moment ago, but just adding more permanent white into the mix. I added some more texture and colour to the mountains in the background, also made a bit of a value adjustment as well. And then the next thing I did was to begin restating the dark values that I'd laid down initially at the start of the painting. So certainly the shadows in this pine tree and the other trees. Now I'm using much thicker paint now with much less water in it, in fact hardly any water at all. But still using the same colours that I used just a moment ago, which was primarily a mix of ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. And I really like this colour combination for shadows in vegetation in general, especially trees and grass, because the yellow ochre actually helps to desaturate the blue anyway, but it also gives it a green cast. So it's not a particularly vibrant colour. However, if you need to increase the vibrancy or the saturation, you could mix in a cadmium yellow, for example, or even viridian, or both. But for the moment I'm just using ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, and you can see how much darker in value it is now that that initial layer is dry. The white of the watercolour paper is totally covered now, and also just because I'm using now thicker paint with much less water in it. So marking in the main areas of shadows, also painting the suggestion of a few branches as well, and just filling in some of these other gaps. The next thing I do at this point in the painting is to start painting the suggestion of a network of main stems and branches in these willows and Lombardy poplar trees. So with gouache painting, I've found that it's really good for creating loose gestural paintings, much like a plein air oil painting, for example. And that's one of the things I really like about gouache. But you can go pretty detailed. I've seen some pretty detailed looking gouache paintings, so I'm just really enjoying getting into using this medium. Now I'm painting the branches here, just marking in the main scaffold and structural branches. I'm using a 1/4 inch angled brush, and I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna. So I'm mainly painting the shadow areas of the stems and branches. Now when it comes to painting the areas of the main stems of these trees that are in light, I've used a mix of permanent white with yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and a little bit of ultramarine blue to desaturate. Now when it comes to painting trees, you don't want to make them look too laboured and paint every single branch and twig on there, otherwise it's just going to look a little bit unnatural. So I found that the best way is to paint the main stems and structural branches, and then just paint a few suggestions of branches here and there. Because in just a moment I'm going to be using the colours that I was using initially in the blocking stage, so the kind of mass of the twigs where it communicates a kind of pastel, earthy brown yellowish colour. And what I'll be doing is I'll be painting over the branches that I've just painted. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm using the same colours that I used in the beginning of the painting, so mostly yellow ochre with burnt sienna, some permanent white in there, and if required some ultramarine blue to desaturate. But I'm just brushing over the paint over the twigs and branches that I've just painted. So I'm trying to communicate a mass of twigs, because if you look at winter trees in the distance, they still look like they've got full canopies, but they're these pale low chroma wooden colours. So as I said earlier, I prefer to treat these types of winter trees as masses and not focus on the individual twigs, but just focus on the tree canopy as a whole. As I mark in the paint, I feather the extremities of the branches, and that's to communicate dense twigs. I want to break up the edges of the tree canopies here just to make them look more natural. So I don't really want to have any kind of solid edges around the tree canopies. Now I've spent a bit of time working on the trees on the right side of the painting, and I apply the same techniques to this smaller willow tree that's on the left side of the painting. So just painting in, filling in a bit of the canopy here, and then just painting a few main stems and branches. Here I'm now in the tidying up and adding detail stage of the painting, where I'm just making the elements within the scene communicate with other parts of the painting, and things like adding some details to the grass. So here I'm painting some shadows. This is going to add to the three-dimensional effect of the painting and also communicate the time of day. It's winter, so the sun's a lot lower in the sky as well, but this is going to help with the overall realism and atmosphere of the painting. Following that, I've been painting some of the straw coloured grass that's within the main areas of grass. So lots of things have died back in winter. There's certainly a lot of straw coloured grass, and this is going to help communicate this cold winter scene. So adding some lighter layers to the fields in the distance, just adding texture to the grass and just building up a bit more detail. Now when I paint artworks, I generally save my lightest values until the end of the painting, and I am getting near to finishing this. So I'm coming in now by painting the areas of these trees, the tree stems and branches that are in the full sunlight, and it's kind of a pale yellowish grey colour. So I've used a mix of permanent white with burnt sienna and yellow ochre. There's a lot of permanent white within the mix. And if these colours are a little bit too saturated, I could just knock it back with a little bit of ultramarine blue. And I'm using a 1/4 inch angular brush here, which is really good for painting branches and main stems, I've found. It certainly produces a good edge to the branches and stems. You could also use a round brush as well if you wanted. I'm not painting every single main stem and branch, just a suggestion of branches. And then I go back over the tree canopies with some lighter layers of paint of the same colour mix I used before. So again, mainly a mix of permanent white, burnt sienna and yellow ochre. Here I'm painting the foliage on the pine tree, and I'm using a mix of ultramarine blue with cadmium yellow. That's the base of my green there. There's also a little bit of yellow ochre in the mix, and if I want to create some lighter values, I can also mix in a small amount of permanent white. There's also some cadmium red in there. I like to add red into my greens just to make it look more natural, and obviously it's a colour opposite as well, so it just helps to harmonise the green in my opinion. And if I want to increase the saturation of the green, I can also mix in a little bit of Viridian. Now here I added some more layers to the clouds, and the other thing with the clouds is I was able to use that mixture to paint a few sky holes in the pine tree. Not only the cloud mix but also the sky mix as well, and that's just going to make the tree look more realistic within the painting. Painting around the negative spaces of your trees is another way that you can paint more realistic looking trees. So this is a technique that I like to use. Certainly working well with the deciduous trees here that are in the foreground, as well as the pine tree. Now if you want to learn more about painting landscapes and painting in general, then you've got to check out my Patreon channel. It's just $5 a month, and each month there's a full painting tutorial video which I upload, plus reference photos, lesson notes. I also upload other bonus content during the month, and there's around 3 years worth of painting tutorial videos on there that you've got instant access to as well. So if you are learning to paint, or you're a beginner, or you want to improve your landscape painting, or even just get inspired by my painting techniques, then check out my Patreon channel. I'll put the link in the description box below. I also have individual painting tutorial videos available for sale from my website, and if you join my email list, I'm giving away a free ebook on Introduction to Oil Painting. So again, the links are in the description box below. For the last part of this painting, I'm just adding the final details. So Little bits of details here and there, tidying up areas, adding a few more twigs and branches to some of the trees, shadow areas. Also little things such as the road signs that are in the distance along this road. This particular road is definitely up there with being one of the most beautiful roads in the whole country. It's an absolute stunning landscape around here, and the one thing that I love about this particular area and this road is it's very easy to just park up and paint the landscape from life on plein air. It's been a while since I've been down to this area, and I'd really like to get down there again sometime in the not too distant future, especially to go plein air painting. Now the painting is complete, and what I love about these particular types of paintings is peeling off the masking tape at the very end, where you can truly see what the painting actually looks like. So I hope you enjoyed this video and it inspires you to paint some landscapes in gouache paint. Thanks for watching, hope you're having a beautiful day, and I'll see you in the next video.